Good morning. My name is Mani Bathia, and I will be presenting to you my Louisiana Slave Database poster. I will be starting with the introduction of my paper. Trying to get it on one side. Okay. So, my introduction reads as follows. This research provided is based off of the Louisiana Slave Database. The Louisiana Slave Database represents 100,000 documents for enslaved people in this state. The document goes back in our history all the way to 1719 when the first slave ship came from Africa. 100,000 slaves were recorded into the Louisiana Slave Database, while some didn't. Dr. Giovanni Hall built and discovered the Louisiana Slave Database. Dr. Hall came across the Louisiana Slave Database documents in the courthouse in Parrish, Louisiana. The purpose of this poster is to explain the history of African Americans and categorize how slaves were presented among the culture during this time period. The Louisiana Slave Database became an eye-opener for different regions, race, gender, and language of our ancestors during this time period. Now I will be going to talk about the methodology of my experiment project research. Okay. The methodology reads as follows. The data presented comes from the Louisiana database created by Dr. Hall. This data contains over 900 recorded and 100 filed. The Louisiana database identifies slaves through different categories in depth. Some examples are shorthand, Aflang, which are the African language spoken by the slaves, the sex, which is the gender of the slaves that came from Africa, and the doc types, which is the type of document to identify each slave that came from Africa. The data presented focus on the types of documents, genders of slaves in African regions they came from. The database presents and provide an understanding of the information that comes to be used for research by students and professors when referring back to slave identification. The Louisiana Slave Database information is very useful when referring back to history of our ancestors in 1719 through 1820. Importantly, the Louisiana database information were used to run frequencies and crosstabs in SPS software. After running frequencies, the data must be imported in a professional bar graph or pie graph to be presented for a visual understanding of the data. So now we are going to go to my abstract. The abstract is basically a little shorthand of the introduction, which reads as follows. The Louisiana Slave Database is a database that contains of 100,000 cases and over 100 files from 1719 to 1820. Dr. Giovanni Hall is the author and creator of the Louisiana Slave Database. Dr. Hall and her team created the database of the information reported to have a better understanding of our history when referring back to our ancestors' culture. Dr. Hall gathers and files thousands of slave files documents for each individual in Louisiana. Now I will be going to my results. Okay. I'm trying to get you guys to see my graphs as clear as they can see. Okay, so my figure 1 graph has 6 different types of documents each slave presented to identify who they were and where they came from. 47.8% of the documents indicated that the slaves were sold, and the smallest percentage of documents show that the slaves had married contracts. From my research, I know that a lot of slaves were married, but during this time period, it was so hard for our male ancestors and our female ancestors to stay together and stay slaves, because as you can see, the majority of them were sold. So we don't know if somebody's wife was sold or somebody's husband was sold. But with that just being said, you could see during this time period that things were not, fair to the Africans at this time, because they were basically all sold for other than a probate. So that's a really important factor. The second biggest type of document is the estate inventory. Yeah, that's basically still referring to being sold. And then the third highest percentage is the miscellaneous percentage. So during this time period, like, the type of documents they were identifying were based off of all different categories. Nothing that was straight-handed, but mostly all slaves were sold. But in my results, I said display the percentage for the types of slave documents recorded to indicate how slaves in the Louisiana database were identified. Okay, so in my figure 2, this is my graph 2. Figure 2, this figure is a visual representation for the type of gender of Louisiana slave database. So during this time period, it was a lot of males that, were on the ship. Like, majority were males. But the numbers are still close, because we have like 50.1% male and 40.3% female. So that is very important. And for our figure 3, it says display percentage for common African regions where majority of slaves came from. So let's move over to this graph to show. Okay. Now, if you can see that Senegal 6.9% came from that region, and African only was not identified as a region, but just African only. That was the second largest percentage of regions that the Africans came from, and the third was Central Africa. So we have Senegal, Central Africa, and Africa only. Syria was the least amount of Africans where they came from, and the Bight of Benin was the least amount of Africans where they came from. Okay, so now we will be going and talking about our graphs and our conclusion, and it states as follows. In conclusion, the graph that I have selected shows the Louisiana slave database substitution and identified as well as the slave's characteristics. Figure 1, the type of documents recorded indicates how slaves in the Louisiana database were identified. Figure 2, the gender of types of slaves that were mainly males. Figure 3 is the African regions where majority of slaves came from. Sagrima. Dr. Hall and her team created the Louisiana slave database of the information reported to have a better understanding of our history of our ancestors. The data presented above in each figure all come from the database. However, the information presented to us will help us have a better understanding of our roots and a better understanding of the slave trade during this time period. Thanks to Dr. Hall and her team, the piece of history didn't disappear, but blossomed for our future generation to notify of what has been taking place in our time period and can be passed down from generations to have more in-depth understanding of the Louisiana database. And this is my reference. Both came from Dr. Hall, the Louisiana Slave Database, and the Code Book. So, yes, we have it. And I am, again, presenting to you my Louisiana Slave Database poster in regarding to the Africans that came from the African regions to the Louisiana state. Thank you and have a nice day.